The sun blazed over Willow Creek, that small western town where gossip was as constant as the wind sweeping through the prairie. The whitewashed church sat proudly at the edge of town, decorated with ribbons and wildflowers that fluttered in the late spring breeze. Every pew inside was filled, not just with well-wishers but with curious onlookers who had come to witness what many whispered was the strangest wedding the town had seen in years. They had heard the rumors. Rancher Luke Carson, widower father, and one of the most respected men in the valley, was remarrying. That alone would have been enough to stir interest. But when word spread that his bride-to-be wasn't a beauty, but rather a large, quiet woman from the neighboring county, the gossip grew wild. She must be after his money, said some. He must have gone blind, laughed others. By the time the church bell rang, half the town had turned up, ready to witness what they believed would be a spectacle. Inside, Luke Carson stood at the altar, tall and broad-shouldered, his weathered hands gripping his hat as he waited. His 6-year-old daughter Annie fidgeted beside him, her golden curls bouncing as she craned her neck toward the door. Luke's face was unreadable, stern yet restless. He was a man who didn't talk much, but those who knew him well could see the tension in his jaw. He'd never cared for talk, but today he could feel it. Dozens of eyes waiting to judge not just his bride, but him too. Then, the doors opened. The chatter died down to a hum as Clara May stepped inside. Her dress was ivory lace, the same one her mother had worn long ago, altered to fit her broader frame. She wasn't conventionally beautiful. Her figure was full, her cheeks round, and her hands clutched a bouquet of wild daisies trembling slightly. But her eyes, soft brown and wide with nervousness, told a story of quiet endurance. As she walked down the aisle, the whispers began to ripple like a cruel tide. "Lord, look at her," someone muttered. "She can barely fit the dress. What was Luke thinking?" Each word seemed to weigh on Clara's shoulders, pressing her down. Her steps faltered. She could hear the faint laughter, see the sideways glances. For a brief, painful second, she considered turning back. The man waiting for her at the end of that aisle was kind and steady, but the crowd's laughter made her doubt she was worthy of standing beside him. Luke's eyes found hers then. Steady, blue and filled with something she couldn't name. Not pity, not shame, but still the humiliation burned. She lowered her gaze, focusing on her hands. Just before she reached the altar, a child's voice broke the silence. "She's pretty, Daddy." Every head turned. There beside Luke stood little Annie, her bright eyes fixed on Clara with genuine admiration. Her words weren't whispered. They rang out with childlike certainty. "She's beautiful, Daddy." The whisper stopped. The laughter died. Even the preacher hesitated, glancing between them. Clara froze mid-step, tears blurring her vision. For the first time in her life, someone had called her beautiful and meant it. Luke's expression softened. He knelt beside his daughter, brushed a strand of hair from her face, and said quietly, but loud enough for all to hear, "Yes, sweetheart?" "She is." Something shifted in the room then, something quiet but powerful. Shame turned into silence. Judgment melted into unease. And in that silence, Clara found the courage to take her final steps forward. By the time she reached Luke's side, her hands had stopped trembling. Annie smiled up at her, and Clara smiled back, her heart full of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The wedding hadn't even begun, but already everything had changed. The church in Willow Creek had never been so full, or so cruel. What should have been a day of joy and promise had become a stage for quiet ridicule, though little Annie Carson's innocent words, "She's beautiful, Daddy," had silenced the worst of it for a moment. The whispers soon returned, slithering through the pews like snakes in tall grass. Clara May stood at the altar beside Luke Carson, her bouquet trembling in her hands. The preacher began his opening words, voice steady but uneasy, his gaze flickering toward the crowd. He too could feel the tension in the air, the kind that made even the candles flicker lower. Clara's cheeks burned under the weight of their stares. Every woman's smirk, every man's whisper pressed down on her shoulders. She could feel her dress clinging uncomfortably to her body, feel the sweat forming under the heavy lace. The sound of a stifled chuckle from the back pew made her flinch. Someone whispered, "Poor Luke." Must be desperate, her heart sank. For years she had lived quietly in her small hometown, baking bread for neighbors, mending clothes for children who called her Miss Clara. But behind closed doors, she had heard the same things. The snickers, the comments about her size, about how no man would ever want her. She thought she had hardened to it. But standing here, in a wedding dress before an entire town, she realized she hadn't. Her throat tightened. The preacher's words blurred together. "Do you, Luke Carson, take this woman?" She barely heard the rest. All she could see were the faces, mocking, judgmental, pitying. Beside her, Luke stood motionless, his hand steady as it held hers. His eyes were fixed on her face, but he didn't speak, not yet. He could see her trembling, could feel her pulse racing through her fingertips. A man of few words, Luke had never been one for speeches, but in that silence his chest filled with anger. He had seen cruelty before, but never directed at someone so undeserving. When the preacher turned to Clara, asking softly, "Do you, Clara May, take this man?" Her voice caught. She opened her mouth, but nothing came. The laughter in the back row returned, low and mean, like a ripple spreading through dirty water. Clara's vision blurred. Tears welled. The room seemed to tilt, her knees weak beneath her. She wanted to run, to escape the eyes, the laughter, the humiliation. She glanced at the door. Just a few steps and she could be free. But then a small hand slipped into hers. Annie, standing just beside her father's leg, reached up and held her fingers. Clara looked down through her tears. The little girl smiled at her, pure, fearless, certain. "It's okay," Annie whispered. "You look like an angel." Something broke open inside Clara then. Not pain this time, but light. She squeezed the little hand back, the warmth anchoring her to the moment. Luke's deep voice followed, low and steady, cutting through the whispers like a knife. "Go on, Clara," he said softly, meeting her eyes. "You've got nothing to be ashamed of." "Not here, not ever." The crowd quieted. The preacher hesitated, then nodded for her to continue. Clara drew a breath, straightened her shoulders, and finally said the words, "I do." Her voice trembled, but it was strong enough to carry across the church. When Luke said his vows in return, he didn't just say, "I do." He said it like a promise, a shield, a vow to protect the woman standing beside him. Not just from loneliness, but from a world that had never been kind. The laughter had broken her heart. But in that moment, surrounded by cruelty, two people, one man and one small child, helped her piece it back together. The church had grown too quiet. The kind of silence that comes after cruelty, thick, heavy, and filled with shame. The laughter had stopped, but its echo lingered in Clara May's heart. She stood at the altar, her vows barely spoken, her hands trembling around the wilted bouquet. Tears threatened to fall, not from joy, but from humiliation so sharp it cut through her chest. She felt exposed, her body, her soul, her every flaw displayed before 100 watchful eyes. She couldn't look at them, couldn't even look at Luke. The words "poor man" still floated in her ears. She wanted to sink into the floor, to vanish into the shadows behind the pulpit. But just then, a soft, uncertain whisper came from below. "She's pretty, Daddy." The words were small, but they carried like music in the silent church. Heads turned, whispers cut short. The voice belonged to Annie Carson, Luke's 6-year-old daughter, her little hands gripping the pew in front of her. She was peering up at Clara with wide blue eyes full of wonder. "She's beautiful, Daddy." It was no childish echo. It was truth, spoken in the pure, fearless tone only a child could manage. Her voice trembled at first, but when no one answered, she said it louder. "She's beautiful." The effect was instant. The crowd, once smug and cruel, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few people lowered their eyes. Others stared at the little girl, unsure what to say. It was as if her words had stripped away their ugliness, leaving only guilt behind. Clara froze, her lips parting slightly. For the first time since she'd stepped into the church, she lifted her gaze. Her eyes met Annie's, and the tears she had been holding back finally fell, but softly this time, not from pain. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had called her beautiful. Perhaps never. And now this little girl, with ribbons in her hair and innocence in her heart, had said it as though it were the most obvious truth in the world. Luke looked down at his daughter, his expression softening in a way that startled even him. His heart swelled with pride and shame. Pride that his little girl saw goodness where others saw difference. Shame that he hadn't spoken sooner. He knelt beside Annie, resting a strong, calloused hand on her shoulder. His voice, usually quiet and measured, carried through the entire church. "Yes, sweetheart," he said gently, turning his eyes toward Clara. "She is beautiful." The silence that followed was unlike the one before. It wasn't cruel now. It was reverent, heavy with realization. Even the preacher, who had stumbled through the earlier vows, stood a little taller, his eyes softening as he looked at the bride before him. Clara didn't know what to do. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, but warmth began to spread through her, slowly, carefully, like sunlight pushing back the dark. She smiled at Annie, a fragile smile, but one that reached her eyes. Annie beamed, proud of herself for saying what no one else dared. She didn't understand why people had been whispering, didn't see the flaws they mocked. She just saw kindness. The woman who had given her sweets at the ranch, who braided her hair when she visited, who never raised her voice or turned away. Luke rose and reached for Clara's hand. His grip was firm, protective. "Let's finish this," he said quietly, though his tone carried more meaning than the words themselves. The preacher resumed, his voice steadier now. The rest of the ceremony passed without a single cruel whisper. The people who had come expecting laughter instead left in silence, each one carrying the echo of that small, powerful voice. "She's beautiful, Daddy." And as Luke led his new bride out into the sunlight, Annie ran ahead, her hand reaching for Clara's. The bride looked down, smiled through her tears, and whispered, "Thank you, sweetheart." The little girl's eyes sparkled. "You're welcome. I told them, didn't I?" Clara nodded, her heart swelling. For the first time, she believed it. Maybe not fully. Not yet. But enough to take her husband's hand with confidence and step into the life waiting beyond the church doors. The moment Annie's innocent words broke through the cruelty, the entire church shifted. The air that had been thick with ridicule softened, the murmurs fading into uneasy silence. The child's voice, pure, unwavering, had done what no scolding adult or angry glare could have done. It had shamed them. It had reminded them of decency. Clara May stood at the altar, her hand still trembling in Luke Carson's. A tear lingered on her cheek, glistening in the soft light filtering through the stained glass. She looked at the little girl who had saved her dignity and whispered under her breath, "Thank you." The preacher, who had been hesitating through the vows, cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. "Shall we continue?" he asked softly. His voice, once uncertain, now carried warmth and steadiness. Luke gave a single nod, his jaw tight but his eyes tender. "Go on," he murmured to Clara. Clara took a slow, steady breath. Her pulse began to settle. When she turned toward Luke, something inside her shifted. The laughter she'd heard moments ago was already fading, replaced by the calm certainty in his gaze. He wasn't embarrassed by her. He wasn't ashamed. He stood beside her, tall, proud, and silent, but his silence spoke of strength. The preacher began again, his words rolling over the quiet congregation. "Do you, Luke Carson, take this woman, Clara May, to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Luke said, his voice deep and unflinching. The preacher turned to Clara. "And do you, Clara May, take this man, Luke Carson, to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Clara's lips trembled, but when she looked into Luke's steady eyes and saw Annie smiling up at her from the front pew, her fear melted away. "I do," she said, her voice soft but certain. A hush filled the room. The words seemed to hang there, alive and glowing as if carried on a new kind of light. When Luke reached for her hand, his touch was gentle but sure. "With this ring," he said, sliding a simple gold band onto her finger, "I give you my name, my home, and my word." Her eyes shimmered as she placed the ring on his finger. "And I give you my heart," she whispered. The preacher smiled, visibly relieved. "Then by the power vested in me by the state of Texas, I now pronounce you husband and wife." For a heartbeat, time seemed to stop. Clara's chest rose and fell as if she were breathing for the first time in years. She didn't expect Luke to kiss her, not here, not after everything. But he did. It wasn't a grand kiss meant to impress the crowd. It was simple, honest. The kind of kiss that said, "I see you. I choose you." A murmur of surprise ran through the church, but not one of mockery. This time it was awe. A few people smiled faintly. Others lowered their heads, ashamed of what they'd said earlier. And through it all, little Annie clapped her small hands together. "Yay!" she squealed. "You did it, Daddy. You did it, Miss Clara." Laughter rippled through the pews, gentle this time, sincere. Even Clara laughed through her tears, bending down to hug the little girl who had given her courage. Luke placed his hand on both of their shoulders, a quiet pride softening his hard features. "Let's go home," he said simply. As they walked out of the church, sunlight poured over them, bright and forgiving. The people who had come to mock now stepped aside, some nodding in quiet respect. Others looked away, unable to meet Clara's eyes. Annie skipped ahead, her small boots pattering against the wooden steps. Clara followed, her heart lighter than it had ever been. She wasn't just a bride anymore, she was part of something real. The wedding had started with shame, but it ended with grace, saved by the pure heart of a little girl who saw beauty where no one else dared to look. The church bells had long fallen silent, and the dust from the carriage wheels settled along the road to Carson Ranch. The laughter and whispers from Willow Creek were now miles away, but their echoes still lingered faintly in Clara May's heart. As she rode beside Luke Carson, her new husband, she kept her hands clasped tightly in her lap, unsure what to say. Luke wasn't a talkative man. He kept his eyes on the winding trail, the reins steady in his weathered hands. His silence, however, wasn't cold, it was thoughtful. He'd never been one for chatter. His actions had always spoken louder, and though he hadn't said much since the ceremony, his small gestures, the way he helped her into the wagon, the way he covered her shoulders with his coat when the air turned chilly, told her more than words could. When they arrived, the Carson Ranch rose against the backdrop of the golden prairie. It wasn't fancy, but it was sturdy, built with years of calloused hands and honest labor. The field stretched wide, and a line of cottonwood swayed in the distance. Cattle lowed somewhere beyond the fence, and the soft clucking of hens greeted them from the yard. "Welcome home," Luke said simply, stepping down to help her. Home. The word almost caught in her throat. For years she had lived in rented rooms or behind other people's kitchens, cooking and cleaning for wages that barely kept her afloat. She had dreamed of a place like this, a home filled with warmth and purpose, but never truly believed it could be hers. Inside, the ranch house was modest but tidy. The walls smelled faintly of cedar and fresh bread. A few framed photographs hung by the hearth, Luke's late wife, a gentle-looking woman, and a small picture of Annie as a baby. Clara paused, her chest tightening. She knew she could never replace the woman who came before her, and she wouldn't try, but she prayed she could build something different, something whole. Annie bounded inside, dragging her small wooden doll by the arm. "Can we show her the chickens, Daddy?" she asked, her blue eyes bright with excitement. Luke gave a faint smile. After supper, Clara set her bag down and moved toward the kitchen, her instincts taking over. "I can cook," she offered softly. "It'll help me settle." Luke nodded once. "We'd like that." She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The scent of roasted chicken and cornbread soon filled the air. Luke sat quietly at the table, mending a bridle strap, while Annie chattered about the ranch animals, her pony, the new calves, and the old dog named Gus who slept by the door. When supper was ready, they bowed their heads together for grace. Clara's hands shook as she reached for Annie's, but the little girl squeezed her fingers tight. "Mama used to make biscuits," Annie said softly, looking up at her. "These taste kind of like hers." Clara blinked rapidly, her throat aching. "That's a nice thing to say, sweetheart," she whispered. Luke looked up from his plate. "She'd be glad someone's baking again," he said quietly. For a while they ate in peace. The clinking of forks and the crackle of the fire became the evening's music. The air felt easier, warmer, almost like belonging. After supper, Clara stepped outside. The night stretched endlessly above, stars scattered across the black sky. From the doorway, Luke watched her for a moment before joining her. "You did good today," he said simply. Clara smiled faintly. "It didn't feel that way." "It did to me," he said, his voice low. "And to Annie, that's what matters." She turned toward him, the wind teasing her hair. For the first time in years, she let herself believe she might be enough, just as she was. Behind them, Annie's laughter floated out from the house, bright, innocent, and full of love. The cruel world of the town felt far away now. On this quiet ranch under the wide Texas sky, Clara's new life had just begun. The weeks that followed brought rhythm and routine to Carson Ranch. For the first time, Clara May began to feel like she belonged. She rose before dawn, helped with the cooking, fed the chickens, and even learned to milk the old cow that Luke jokingly called Miss Temper. Her laughter began to mingle with Annie's, and the house that once echoed with quiet grief slowly filled with warmth. But the prairie had its own moods, and one evening, it turned cruel. The air grew heavy that afternoon, still and tense, as if the sky were holding its breath. Luke Carson stood on the porch squinting at the horizon. Dark clouds gathered fast, low and angry, crawling toward them like smoke. He knew that kind of storm. Out here on open land, it could tear through the ranch like a beast. "Annie, inside," he called, his tone sharp but calm. The little girl obeyed, clutching her doll as thunder rolled in the distance. Clara followed, her brow creased with worry. "Luke?" she asked softly. "Is it bad?" He nodded. "Could be. Tie the shutters, stay close to Annie." Lightning forked across the sky as the wind howled through the grass. Rain hit the windows in hard sheets and the walls rattled under its fury. Annie whimpered and buried herself against Clara's skirts. "It's all right, sweetheart," Clara murmured, wrapping her arms around her. "It's just thunder talking to the sky." Luke worked outside as long as he dared, securing the barn doors, covering the tools, checking on the cattle. By the time he stumbled back in, soaked to the bone, the storm was roaring full force. He hung his hat and coat, wiped his face, and went to check the lanterns. It was then that the sound pierced through the thunder, a faint cry, high and distant. Annie gasped, looking toward the door. "My kitten!" she cried.
"Snowdrop's outside."
Luke's head snapped up.
"Annie, no."
But before he could grab her, the little girl darted for the door, her small boots splashing through puddles as she disappeared into the darkness. "Annie!" Clara screamed, racing after her. Luke lunged, but she was already gone into the storm. He cursed under his breath, grabbed his lantern, and followed. The rain stung like needles. The wind tore at Clara's skirt as she stumbled through the yard, calling Annie's name again and again. The storm swallowed her voice. She could barely see, but she pressed on, her heart pounding wildly. Somewhere ahead, she thought she heard a small sob. "Annie!" she cried again, pushing through the mud toward the barn. And there, under a broken branch that had fallen near the fence, she saw her. Annie was crouched low, clutching a tiny white kitten, crying in terror. "Sweetheart," Clara dropped to her knees, pulling the girl into her arms. "I've got you, baby. I've got you," but the wind was too strong. Another gust ripped the lantern from her hand, plunging them into darkness. The branch above them creaked, threatening to fall. Clara didn't think. She threw her body over Annie's, shielding her as the limb crashed down beside them, splintering into the mud. Moments later, Luke's shout cut through the storm. He ran toward the sound, his lantern swinging wildly. When the light fell on them, Clara's body curled protectively around his daughter, his breath caught in his chest. "Clara!" He dropped beside them, lifting the fallen branch with a grunt and pulling them both free. Annie clung to her father, sobbing, while Clara shivered, her hair plastered to her face, her lips pale. Luke wrapped his arms around both of them, holding them close as the rain poured down. "You're safe," he murmured, voice rough. "You're both safe." When they finally made it back to the house, Luke laid Annie by the fire and covered her with blankets. Then he turned to Clara. Her hands were scraped, her clothes torn, but her eyes, tired and gentle, met his. "She's fine," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "That's all that matters." Luke stared at her, emotion tightening his throat. "You went into that storm for her," he said quietly. "You could have been killed." Clara gave a faint smile.
"So could you once."
"For someone you loved." Something unspoken passed between them then, an understanding, deep and wordless. Luke reached out, brushed a strand of wet hair from her cheek, and whispered, "You're a brave woman, Clara May Carson." And for the first time, he said her full name, not as a formality, but as a promise. When the storm finally passed, Carson Ranch lay battered but standing like its people. Branches littered the yard, the chicken coop roof was torn, and the barn door hung crooked. But everyone was safe. That morning, the sunrise broke through the clouds, gold spilling across the wet fields, and for the first time, Clara May stepped outside feeling something she hadn't known in years, peace. Inside, Annie was curled up by the fire, her kitten purring on her lap. Luke Carson leaned against the doorway, watching Clara quietly as she swept rainwater from the porch. Her hair was still damp, her hands scraped, but there was a calm strength in her movements. Steady, sure, like she belonged here. "You should rest," Luke said gently. Clara smiled faintly. If I stop, I'll start thinking about what could have happened. He crossed his arms, studying her. You kept my little girl alive. I don't think I'll ever forget that. She blushed, shaking her head. Any mother would have done the same. Luke's voice softened. That's just it, Clara, you are one now. The words caught her off guard. Her throat tightened, her heart swelled. She turned away quickly so he wouldn't see the tears in her eyes. By mid-morning, word of what had happened spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. Out here, news traveled faster than horses. Folks heard that the obese bride everyone had mocked had risked her life to save Luke Carson's daughter during the storm. At the general store, Mrs. Tully, the same woman who had snickered at the wedding, covered her mouth in shame. That poor woman nearly died protecting that child, she whispered to her husband. Guess she's got more courage than the lot of us, he muttered. By afternoon, a few neighbors rode out to the ranch to help. Men mended fences, women brought food, pies, biscuits, jars of preserves. They didn't say much at first, but their faces spoke volumes. Clara, surprised, met them with quiet grace. She thanked each one sincerely, though she could feel their eyes on her. Curious, guilty, softening. Even the preacher came by, his hat in hand. Mrs. Carson, he said, his voice gentle, the Lord must have known what he was doing bringing you here. Clara smiled humbly. I reckon he did, though I doubted it at first. Later that week, she and Luke brought Annie into town for supplies. As they walked down Main Street, heads turned, but this time not in mockery. The blacksmith tipped his hat. Mrs. Tully stepped forward with a shy smile. Mrs. Carson, she said quietly, I was wrong about you. We all were. Clara hesitated, then returned the smile. It's all right. Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air. Even the tailor, who had once laughed about her wedding dress, offered, If you bring that gown by, I'll mend it proper. No charge. Clara's cheeks flushed with gratitude. Thank you kindly. As they left the store, Annie clung to her hand, skipping along the boardwalk. Mama, she said proudly, everybody likes you now. Clara chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Maybe they're just seeing better this time. Luke walked a step behind, his eyes warm as he watched them. He'd seen plenty of storms in his life, on the land and in his heart, but none had brought such peace afterward. That evening, back at the ranch, neighbors lingered on the porch, sharing food and laughter. Clara served coffee, her laughter mingling easily with theirs. Luke sat beside her, Annie in his lap, and for the first time since his first wife's passing, the ranch didn't feel heavy with loss. It felt alive again. As the sun dipped low, Luke looked at Clara. Seems folks finally see what Annie did, he said softly. Clara smiled, her eyes glowing in the fading light. Children see clearer than grown-ups ever do. Luke reached for her hand under the table, and she didn't pull away. The world that had once mocked her now looked on with quiet respect. And in that golden hour, surrounded by laughter and love, Clara realized she hadn't just survived the storm. She had changed it. The seasons rolled on, soft and sure, like a hymn carried on the wind. Winter's chill melted into spring, and the ranch that once stood quiet and lonely now rang with laughter, music, and the hum of life. The hens clucked in the yard, the horses grazed near the fence line, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen window. Inside, Clara Carson stood at the stove, humming softly as she stirred a pot of stew. Her figure, still full and soft, moved easily around the room, her apron dusted with flour, her cheeks pink from the warmth of the fire. She didn't hide anymore. She didn't shrink when others looked her way. The woman who once feared her reflection now smiled at it. In the next room, Annie sat on the floor surrounded by dolls and bits of cloth. Mama, look, she called out proudly. I made her a bonnet just like yours. Clara wiped her hands and knelt beside her. It's perfect, sweetheart, Annie beamed, tilting her head. Daddy says I got your hands. He says they're strong and gentle. Clara's heart swelled. Your daddy says kind things. At that moment, Luke stepped into the doorway, a soft smile on his face. Only when they're true, he said, his deep voice wrapping around her like a blanket. He crossed the room, dusting the hay off his sleeves, and kissed the top of Clara's head. It was a simple thing, a kiss, a look, but it carried all the meaning in the world. For so long, Luke had thought his heart had closed after losing his wife, yet somehow Clara had opened it again. not with beauty or charm, but with kindness and quiet courage. That evening, they hosted supper for a few neighbors, something Clara once would have dreaded. But now she welcomed it. The long table was covered with food: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, cornbread, and Clara's famous apple cobbler. The preacher's wife leaned across the table, smiling. "Clara, you've brought more light to this valley than you know. Seems the good Lord meant for you to be right here." Clara blushed, shaking her head. "I'm just thankful to have a place to belong." Luke took her hand beneath the table. "Belonging's not given, Clara, you built it." His words settled deep in her heart. She remembered how she had arrived, scared, humiliated, unsure of herself. The woman she was then would never have believed she'd be sitting here now, surrounded by warmth, family, and acceptance. After supper, the guests drifted home under a sky painted in shades of violet and silver. Annie had fallen asleep on Clara's lap, her small fingers curled around her mother's apron. Luke sat beside them, his arm draped over the back of the couch. The fire crackled, filling the quiet with a soft rhythm. "You know," Luke said after a while, "I used to think strength was about how much a man could lift or how much land he could work." He looked at her, eyes soft. "But watching you, I reckon strength's about how much love a person can carry and still keep giving." Clara's throat tightened. "I didn't think I had much left to give," she admitted quietly. Luke smiled, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "You had more than enough for both of us." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw the truth of it. This man, this child, this home, they weren't the life she had planned, but they were the life she'd prayed for in silence. As the fire burned low, she whispered, "Do you remember what Annie said the first day we met?" Luke nodded with a grin. "She's beautiful, Daddy." Clara chuckled softly. "She saw something I didn't yet." Luke squeezed her hand. "Now you do." Outside, the stars glittered like promises kept. The ranch was quiet, wrapped in peace, and as Luke pulled her close and Annie murmured in her sleep, Clara realized she was no longer the woman who'd been laughed off, pitied, or ignored. She was Clara Carson, a wife, a mother, and the heart of a home that loved her exactly as she was. The laughter that drifted from that little ranch house that night carried through the valley like music, gentle and true, proof that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the places once broken.